75 years old, a lifetime in boxing, 48 victories as a professional, 20 successful title defenses, one of the greatest heavyweight champions in history. And yet, when Larry Holmes looks back at his career, all he sees is one face, one name, one fight that destroyed everything. Muhammad Ali, the man who was his hero, his mentor, his idol, the same man who, without even trying, ruined Larry Holmes' legacy forever. At 75, Holmes is finally ready to tell the truth about how beating the greatest boxer of all time became the worst thing that ever happened to him. 73, a young heavyweight from Easton, Pennsylvania, walked into a gym in Deer Lake. His name was Larry Holmes, and he was nobody. No amateur pedigree, no Olympic medals, just raw talent and hunger. He was there for one reason: to be Muhammad Ali's sparring partner. The greatest fighter in the world needed someone tough enough to prepare him for wars. And Larry Holmes, he was perfect for the job. For 4 years, Holmes absorbed everything Ali had: the footwork, the timing, the mind games. He studied the master, watched how Ali moved, how he thought, how he turned boxing into art. But Holmes wasn't just learning. He was waiting, because deep down he knew something Ali didn't. One day, the student would be better than the teacher. 1973, Holmes turned professional. No fanfare, no hype, just a kid who could fight. And fight he did. Win after win after win. Knockouts, decisions, domination. By 1978, Larry Holmes had earned a shot at the WBC Heavyweight Championship. His opponent, Ken Norton, a man who'd beaten Muhammad Ali. And on June 9, 1978, in a brutal 15-round war, Larry Holmes won a split decision. World champion. The kid from Easton had reached the summit, but the world barely noticed, because in 1978, there was only one heavyweight the world cared about, and his name was still Muhammad Ali. What Holmes did next should have made him a legend. He defended that title 20 consecutive times. 20. Ernie Shavers, the hardest puncher in history? Holmes beat him. Mike Weaver, destroyed. Leon Spinks, the man who beat Ali, dominated. Jerry Cooney, in front of 32,000 fans, stopped him. For 4 years, Larry Holmes was the most dominant heavyweight champion since Joe Louis. His jab was a weapon. His stamina was endless. His ring IQ was genius. He was doing everything right, winning every fight, defending against all challengers, building a resume that should have put him in the conversation with the all-time greats. But nobody was watching. Nobody was caring, because Muhammad Ali's shadow was too big. And that shadow, it was about to consume him. 1980, Muhammad Ali was 38 years old, retired for 2 years. His body was breaking down. The reflexes were gone. The speed was fading, and something darker was happening, something nobody wanted to talk about. The slurred speech, the trembling hands, the early signs of what would later be diagnosed as Parkinson's disease. Ali should have been resting, enjoying retirement, protecting what was left of his health. But Muhammad Ali had a problem. He was broke. Years of mismanagement, bad investments, and an expensive lifestyle had drained his fortune. He needed money. And the only way to get it? One more fight. When the announcement came that Ali was returning, the boxing world went insane. Ali versus Larry Holmes, October 2nd, 1980, Las Vegas, Caesar's Palace. The student versus the teacher, the current champion versus the legend. It was the fight everyone wanted to see, except for one person, Larry Holmes. Holmes didn't want this fight. Not like this. Not against a man who was clearly past his prime. Not against his hero. In interviews before the fight, you could see it in Holmes's eyes. The conflict. He respected Ali, loved him. Ali had given him opportunities when nobody else would. But this was business. This was his legacy. And Ali. Ali was talking like the old days. Trash talk, predictions, calling Holmes his sparring partner, saying he'd retire Holmes. The media ate it up. But people close to the fight saw something different. They saw an aging warrior who could barely train, who was taking medication just to function, who had no business being in a boxing ring. And they saw Larry Holmes torn between respect for his idol and the reality of what he had to do. Destroy him. The press conferences were brutal to watch. Ali tried to be the old Ali, the loud Ali, the Ali who predicted rounds and danced for cameras. But his words came out slower, his movements were stiff, his face looked tired. And Larry Holmes, he looked like a man being forced to do something terrible. He barely trash-talked back. He spoke with respect, almost like he was begging Ali to walk away. But the fight was signed. The money was on the table. And on October 2nd, 1980, in front of 24,000 fans at Caesar's Palace, Larry Holmes and Muhammad Ali would step into the ring. What happened next would haunt Holmes for the rest of his life. Because that night, Larry Holmes didn't just beat Muhammad Ali, he exposed him, humiliated him, and in doing so, became the most hated man in boxing. Not because of what he did in the ring, but because the world couldn't forgive him for beating their hero. Years later, Holmes would say something that revealed everything. I knew before the first punch was thrown that I couldn't win that night. If I lost, I'd be a joke. If I won, I'd be a villain. There was no way out. And he was right. Because what happened in that ring over 10 brutal rounds wasn't just a fight. It was a tragedy. And Larry Holmes, he was forced to play the role of the bad guy in someone else's story. The fight that should have cemented his legacy instead became the fight that destroyed it. And 44 years later, at 75 years old, sitting in his home in Easton, Pennsylvania, Larry Holmes is still angry, still bitter, still wondering what his career would have looked like if Muhammad Ali had just stayed retired. Because beating the greatest boxer of all time, it turned out to be the worst thing Larry Holmes ever did. October 2nd, 1980, the lights dimmed at Caesar's Palace. 24,000 fans packed into the outdoor arena, millions watching on closed-circuit television around the world. And in that ring stood two men who represented two different ERAs. Larry Holmes, 30 years old, in his prime, undefeated, the current heavyweight champion, and Muhammad Ali, 38 years old, a legend trying to prove he had one more miracle left. The bell rang, and what happened over the next 10 rounds wasn't a boxing match. It was an execution. Round 1. Within 30 seconds, everyone watching knew something was wrong. Ali's legs were stiff. His reflexes were gone. The jab that once snapped like lightning now came out slow and weak. Holmes circled, measured, and threw his first real punch. A jab that snapped Ali's head back. The crowd gasped. This wasn't the Ali they remembered. This was a man who had no business being in a professional boxing ring. And Holmes? He looked like a man being forced to do something terrible. His face wasn't showing confidence. It was showing pain. Round 2. Round 3. Holmes landed jab after jab after jab. Clean. Powerful. Punches that Ali used to slip with ease now landed flush on his face. Ali tried to fight back, throwing punches that missed by feet. His famous shuffle. He could barely lift his legs. His corner was screaming instructions, but Ali couldn't respond. His body wasn't listening anymore, and between rounds you could see it in Ali's eyes. Confusion. Like he didn't understand why his body was betraying him. Angelo Dundee, his legendary trainer, wiped his face and whispered something. But whatever it was, it didn't help. Because Ali was finished. And everyone knew it, except Ali himself. Rounds 4 through 7 were brutal to watch. Holmes was no longer measuring his punches. He was landing them. Hard rights to the body. Jabs that snapped Ali's head back repeatedly. Hooks that made Ali stumble. This wasn't competitive. This was abuse. And the worst part, Holmes was holding back. You could see it. Moments where he had Ali hurt and stepped back instead of finishing him. Moments where he could have thrown the knockout punch but didn't, because Larry Holmes didn't want to knock out Muhammad Ali. He wanted the fight to stop. He wanted someone in Ali's corner to throw the towel, to end this nightmare, but they didn't. Ali kept coming forward, stumbling, struggling, refusing to quit, and Holmes had no choice but to keep punishing him. Between rounds, cameras caught something extraordinary. Larry Holmes sitting in his corner, and on his face, tears. Not sweat, tears. He was crying while beating his idol. His trainer tried to refocus him. "You're winning every round. Keep doing what you're doing." But Holmes wasn't listening. He was watching Ali across the ring, watching him struggle to stand, watching his cornermen desperately trying to revive a man who should have retired years ago. And Holmes understood something in that moment that would haunt him forever. He was destroying the legacy of the greatest boxer who ever lived, and the world was going to hate him for it. Round 8. Ali could barely lift his arms. His face was swollen. His legs were completely gone. Holmes landed at will, jabs, rights, hooks, combinations. Ali couldn't defend, couldn't counter, couldn't even move. He was a statue being destroyed piece by piece. Round 9. The crowd started booing. Not booing Ali, booing the fight. Booing that nobody was stopping this. Booing that Ali's corner was letting their fighter get tortured. Round 10. Ali stumbled to his corner after the bell, sat on his stool, and didn't get up. Angelo Dundee looked at the ringside doctor, looked at Muhammad Ali, and made the decision Ali's pride wouldn't let him make. He waved his hand. It was over. Technical knockout. Larry Holmes retained his title. But in that moment, as the referee raised Holmes' hand, Larry Holmes felt like he'd lost everything. The post-fight scene was devastating. Ali could barely walk to the dressing room. His speech was slurred. His hands were shaking. The man who once danced and joked after fights now looked like someone who'd been in a car accident. And Holmes, he couldn't even celebrate. In his dressing room, instead of champagne and cheers, there was silence. Holmes sat with his head in his hands. He'd just successfully defended his title for the 7th time, dominated from start to finish, done everything a champion is supposed to do. But he felt like a villain. And within hours, he'd realize he was right. The next morning, the headlines rolled in. And they were brutal. Holmes destroys Ali. The end of an era. Ali should never have fought. But here's what nobody wrote. Holmes proves he's a great champion. The narrative wasn't about Holmes' skill. It was about Ali's decline. And somehow, in the public's mind, that became Holmes' fault. Letters started pouring in. Hate mail, death threats, people screaming at him on the street. The boxing world, the media, the fans, they all turned on Larry Holmes, not because he cheated, not because he was dirty, but because he did his job. He beat Muhammad Ali, and the world couldn't forgive him for it. Holmes tried to move on, defended his title again, and again, and again. By 1985, he had 20 successful defenses, just one away from tying Rocky Marciano's legendary 49-0 record. He was doing everything right, but every interview, every press conference, every public appearance, the same question came up. How do you feel about beating Muhammad Ali? Not about his other victories, not about his legacy, just about the one fight he wished he could erase. And that question, it would follow him for the next 44 years. Because that's the cruel reality of what happened on October 2nd, 1980. Larry Holmes didn't just beat Muhammad Ali, he inherited Ali's shadow. And that shadow, it swallowed him whole. Decades later, Holmes would say in interviews, "I was the best heavyweight of my era. I proved it every time I stepped in the ring. But because I beat Ali, nobody remembers that. They remember the crying. They remember Ali stumbling. They remember me as the guy who beat their hero. And you know what the worst part is? Ali didn't even blame me. He never held it against me. He understood it was business. But the fans, they never forgave me. And they never will." That's the tragedy of Larry Holmes. He did everything a champion is supposed to do. Fought the best, beat them all, defended his title more times than almost anyone in history. But because one of those opponents was Muhammad Ali, a man who should never have been in that ring, Larry Holmes became boxing's greatest villain, not because he was dirty, not because he was arrogant, but because he was too good at his job. And now, at 75 years old, sitting in his home, looking back at a career that should have made him a legend, Larry Holmes is finally saying what he's felt for 44 years. Muhammad Ali destroyed my life, not intentionally, not maliciously, but by being Muhammad Ali, by being so beloved that anyone who beat him became public enemy number one, by coming back when he shouldn't have and forcing Holmes to be the bad guy in someone else's story. The fight lasted 10 rounds, but the damage, that lasted a lifetime. September 21st, 1985, Las Vegas. Larry Holmes stepped into the ring with 48 victories and 0 losses. One win away from matching Rocky Marciano's legendary 49-0 record. One fight away from cementing his place among the all-time greats. His opponent, Michael Spinks, a light heavyweight moving up. Smaller, less experienced at heavyweight. Holmes was the favorite, and for 15 rounds, Holmes fought. But when the decision was announced, the judges gave it to Spinks. A controversial decision that stunned the boxing world. Holmes was furious, not just because he lost, but because he knew what this meant. His chance to tie Marciano's record was gone. His undefeated streak was over. And the one thing that might have made people forget about the Ali fight, it would never happen. That night, Larry Holmes didn't just lose a boxing match. He lost his last chance at redemption. After the Spinks loss, something inside Larry Holmes broke. The bitterness that had been building for 5 years finally exploded. In interviews, he stopped being diplomatic, stopped being respectful. He started saying what he'd been thinking all along. Rocky Marciano couldn't carry my jockstrap. He said it on national television, and the backlash was immediate. The media crucified him. Fans turned even more against him. Boxing historians called him classless. But Holmes didn't care anymore. He was tired of being compared to other champions, tired of being asked about Muhammad Ali, tired of fighting for respect he'd never receive. He'd done everything right, beat everyone they put in front of him, and it still wasn't enough. So he stopped trying to be the good guy, because in his mind, the world had already decided he was the villain. 1988. Holmes retired. At 38 years old with a record of 48-3, he walked away from boxing. He'd given the sport everything. 2 decades of his life, his body, his health, his reputation. And what did he have to show for it? A legacy forever, tied to one fight he wished had never happened. But retirement didn't bring peace. It brought something worse. Silence. No more crowds. No more cameras. No more purpose. And that's when Holmes realized something devastating. Boxing was all he had. Without it, he was nothing. So 2 years later, he came back. Not for glory, not for legacy, for money. And what followed was sad to watch. Holmes fought into his 50s, taking fights he had no business taking, getting knocked out by younger, stronger fighters, damaging what was left of his reputation, all because he couldn't let go. The 1990s and 2000s turned Larry Holmes into boxing's angriest old man. Every interview was filled with bitterness. Every public appearance was a complaint. He'd talk about how he never got respect, how the media treated him unfairly, how young fans didn't appreciate what he'd accomplished. And at the center of every rant, Muhammad Ali. Even decades later, even as Ali's health declined, even as Parkinson's disease slowly took away the man who once floated like a butterfly, Holmes couldn't let it go. I beat Ali fair and square, he'd say. I did what I had to do, but nobody wants to remember that. They only remember I beat their hero. And the tragedy? He was right. Nobody did remember his greatness. They only remembered October 2nd, 1980. The night Larry Holmes destroyed Muhammad Ali. June 3, 2016, Muhammad Ali passed away at 74 years old. The world mourned. Presidents, kings, celebrities, millions of fans paid tribute to the greatest, and Larry Holmes. He attended the funeral, stood among Ali's family and friends, and for the first time in 36 years, he felt something other than anger. He felt grief, not just for Ali, but for himself. Because in that moment, Holmes realized something he'd been denying for decades. Muhammad Ali wasn't his enemy. Ali never hated him. Ali understood it was just business. The hatred had always been one-sided. It came from the fans, from the media, from a world that needed someone to blame for Ali's decline. And Larry Holmes, he'd spent 36 years being that scapegoat, hating Ali for something Ali never did to him. After the funeral, Holmes gave an interview, and for the first time, his voice softened. Ali was a great man, he said. I wish people remembered that I respected him, that I cried beating him, that I never wanted that fight to happen. But even then, even in Ali's death, the narrative didn't change. The headlines weren't about Holmes's respect. They were about the fight, always about the fight. The years that followed Ali's death didn't bring closure. They brought more of the same. More interviews where Holmes had to defend himself. More documentaries where the 1980 fight was the centerpiece. More questions about how he felt beating his idol. And every time, you could see it in Holmes' eyes. Exhaustion. He was tired of explaining, tired of defending, Tired of being remembered for one night instead of 20 title defenses. Tired of being the answer to a trivia question, who beat Muhammad Ali in his last fight? That's his legacy, not the 48 victories, not the decade of dominance, not being one of the greatest jabbers in boxing history, just the guy who beat Ali. And no matter how many times he tells his story, no matter how many interviews he gives, that narrative will never change. Today, at 75 years old, Larry Holmes lives in Easton, Pennsylvania, the same town he grew up in. He runs a restaurant, makes occasional public appearances, signs autographs for fans who remember. But when you talk to him, really talk to him, the bitterness is still there. Not as loud, not as angry, but still there, like a wound that never fully healed. In a 2023 interview, Holmes was asked the question he's been asked 1,000 times. Do you regret fighting Muhammad Ali? And for the first time, his answer was different. I regret that the world made me the villain for doing my job. I regret that people blamed me for Ali's decline when he chose to come back. I regret that my legacy will always be tied to that one night. But do I regret fighting him? No. Because if I'd said no, if I'd refused the fight, people would have called me a coward. There was no way to win. Not in the ring. Not in public opinion. I was doomed from the moment that fight was announced. And that's the truth Larry Holmes has lived with for 44 years. He was put in an impossible situation. Fight his idol and become a villain. Refuse the fight and be called a coward. He chose to fight. He chose to be professional, and the world punished him for it. Muhammad Ali didn't destroy Larry Holmes' life intentionally. He destroyed it by being too beloved, by being so iconic that anyone who beat him, even a man who cried while doing it, became the enemy. Holmes spent his entire career chasing respect, and the one night he proved he was the best heavyweight on the planet. That became the night that destroyed his legacy, not because of what he did, but because of who he had to do it to. At 75, Larry Holmes is finally at peace with one thing. He was a great champion. 48-0 before the Spinks fight, 20 title defenses, one of the best jabs in history, a resume that belongs in the Hall of Greatness. But he's also accepted something painful. The world will never see him that way. They'll always see him as the man who beat Muhammad Ali, the man who ended an ERA, the man who made them watch their hero fall. And maybe that's the cruelest truth in sports. Sometimes doing everything right still makes you the villain. Sometimes winning means losing everything that matters. Larry Holmes beat Muhammad Ali, and in doing so, he lost his place in history. That's not fair. It's not just, but it's the reality of what happened on October 2nd, 1980, the night a champion proved he was great and the world decided he was a villain. And 44 years later, that judgment stands, unchanged, unforgiving, and utterly, completely unfair.